Society tends to ask the same tired question. What do you bring to the table? But the heart asks something far more honest. Is this what I truly want? And if it isn't, why am I still here? Most marriages follow a familiar rhythm. Flirtation, candlelit dinners, a ring on one knee, and vows wrapped in white lace. But for Timothy Richardson and Jane Elizabeth Carter, it was based on strategy. Two brilliant minds aligning not for sparks and sonnets, but for leverage and the quiet promise of stability. Until emotional bankruptcy and jealousy awakened something in Timothy he didn't know he still possessed: the will to fight for love. The wedding photos told a perfect lie. Timothy Richardson, 34, stood beside Jane Carter, 31, on the marble steps of San Francisco City Hall. His Armani suit pressed to perfection. Her ivory dress flowing like silk water. Both wore the kind of smiles that graced Forbes covers, polished, professional, and completely hollow. They never kissed. Not even for the cameras. 3 years later, nothing had changed. Richardson Tech occupied 47 floors of the Salesforce Tower. Timothy, the visionary CEO, commanded the top floor corner office with panoramic views of the Bay. Jane, his chief operating officer and wife, ruled from the office directly across the hall. Between them stretched 100 feet of marble hallway and an ocean of emotional distance. Their penthouse in Pacific Heights reflected their relationship perfectly. 2 master bedrooms on opposite wings, connected by a living space neither of them actually lived in. Timothy kept his vintage whiskey collection in the library. Jane maintained her meditation corner by the floor-to-ceiling windows. They moved through their shared space like polite strangers in an expensive hotel. The marriage had been Patricia Kellerman's idea. Patricia, the steel-haired board chairwoman who'd guided Richardson Tech from startup to empire, presented the proposal during a quarterly meeting in December 2020. Tax advantages aside, Patricia had explained, sliding contracts across the mahogany table, market perception matters. A married CEO appears stable, committed, family-oriented. Jane already knows every aspect of this company. The transition would be seamless. Timothy had looked across the conference table at Jane. Her dark hair was pulled back in that same efficient bun she'd worn for 6 years as his COO. Her brown eyes held no emotion, just the quiet calculation that had helped them corner the artificial intelligence market. "What do you think?" he'd asked. "I think it makes sense," Jane had replied in that measured tone she used for quarterly projections. For the company. No declarations of love. No romantic gestures. Just signatures on legal documents and a press release announcing their longtime partnership had evolved into marriage. Now, 3 years into their arrangement, they maintained the performance flawlessly. Joint appearances at tech conferences. Matching Patek Philippe watches. His gift for their 2nd anniversary. A shared calendar managed by Timothy's assistant, Catherine, who scheduled everything from board meetings to their mandatory date nights. But beneath the surface, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Jane had stopped wearing the perfume she'd loved, Chanel No. 5, because Timothy never noticed it anyway. She'd replaced it with something neutral, something that wouldn't remind her of the woman she used to be before becoming Mrs. Richardson. Timothy filled their silence with work. 18-hour days. Weekend strategy sessions. Business calls during the rare dinners they shared in their formal dining room, where Jane would sit across from him, cutting her salmon into precise pieces while he discussed acquisition targets with investors in Tokyo. The loneliness had become a third presence in their marriage, a shadow that followed them through pristine hallways and echoed in their separate bedrooms. Jane's bedroom faced east, catching the first light over San Francisco Bay. She'd wake each morning at 5:30, practice yoga on her private balcony, then prepare for another day of perfectly coordinated professional intimacy with the man who wore her wedding ring but had never truly touched her soul or her body. The secret that would have destroyed them both lived in the space between their bedrooms. 3 years married and they had never made love. Not once. The closest they'd come was a business trip to Austin, when Jane had reached for him in the darkness of their shared hotel suite. Timothy had pulled away, feigning sleep, leaving Jane to stare at the ceiling until dawn. She never tried again. Instead, she channeled everything into Richardson Tech, becoming the most respected COO in Silicon Valley. Under her leadership, their AI ethics division had revolutionized the industry. She testified before Congress, graced the cover of Harvard Business Review, and earned the kind of professional recognition that should have filled the emptiness inside her chest. But late at night, in her king-sized bed with Egyptian cotton sheets, Jane would hold her pillow and remember what it felt like to be desired by someone who saw her as more than an exceptionally capable business partner. Timothy, meanwhile, lived in a different kind of prison. Every morning, he'd glimpse Jane in her silk pajamas through the crack in her bedroom door as she practiced Tai Chi in the early light. Every evening, he'd watch her read financial reports while wearing reading glasses that somehow made her look both intellectual and impossibly beautiful. But he never told her. Never touched her. Never bridged the gap between professional admiration and personal want. Because somewhere in the back of his mind lived the ghost of Chelsea Morrison, his college girlfriend who'd moved to London for graduate school and never come back. Chelsea, who sent Christmas cards with photos of her life in Notting Hill. Chelsea, who'd called to congratulate him on his marriage and whose voice still made his chest tighten with possibility. Chelsea represented everything spontaneous and passionate that his life with Jane was not. In his weaker moments, Timothy wondered if he'd married Jane because she was safe, brilliant enough to be his partner, but predictable enough never to threaten the fantasy he maintained about the life he might have lived across the Atlantic. The irony was crushing. He'd married Jane for her mind and completely ignored the rest of her. But her mind was exactly what made their emotional distance so devastating. She understood him better than anyone alive, could predict his decisions, finish his sentences, navigate his moods with surgical precision. She knew he didn't love her the way a husband should love a wife. And that knowledge was killing them both, one perfectly polished day at a time. If you're feeling the tension building, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Have you ever felt invisible to someone who should see you most clearly? The Napa Valley Tech Innovation Summit was Jane's idea. Richardson Tech needed to showcase their new ethical AI framework, and the intimate setting would allow for meaningful connections with potential partners. Timothy approved the budget without looking up from his laptop. "Take the corporate suite at Auberge du Soleil," he'd said absently. "Network with the sustainability crowd. Make sure our carbon-neutral messaging is consistent." Jane had wanted to invite him. The words formed in her throat. "Come with me. Let's pretend this is a getaway instead of work." But Timothy was already 3 conversations deep into a merger discussion with a semiconductor company in Taiwan. So Jane drove north alone in her Tesla Model S, checking into the luxury resort as Mrs. Richardson, while feeling more like Jane Carter than she had in years. The conference cocktail reception buzzed with the usual Silicon Valley energy, venture capitalists and expensive casual where startup founders pitching their world-changing ideas to anyone holding a wine glass, and the subtle hierarchy that determined who got 5 minutes of conversation versus who got invited to private dinners. Jane positioned herself near the Sustainable Technology Pavilion, prepared to discuss Richardson Tech's carbon-neutral server farms, when a voice behind her said, "You're the architect behind the AI Ethics Accreditation Program." She turned to find David Michael Hendricks studying her with genuine interest. David was 38, tall and lean with the kind of silver-touched hair that suggested wisdom rather than age. His navy blazer was perfectly tailored, but he wore it with an ease that spoke of old money rather than nouveau riche tech wealth. Most people introduce me as Timothy Richardson's wife, Jane replied carefully. Most people are idiots, David said, extending his hand. David Hendricks, Meridian Ventures. I've been following your work since the congressional hearings. Your testimony on algorithmic bias probably saved the industry from federal regulation. Jane felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Recognition. Not of David, but of herself being truly seen by someone other than a boardroom full of investors. Your Hendricks Real Estate Group, she said, accepting his handshake and noting how he held her fingers a beat longer than necessary. Your family built half of downtown Seattle. Guilty. Though I've been making my own way in clean technology for the past decade. Less concrete, more conscience. His smile reached his eyes. Would you mind if I stole you from the networking vultures? I'd love to hear your thoughts on regulating predictive algorithms and hiring practices. They found a quiet corner near the resort's infinity pool, where fairy lights reflected off water that seemed to spill directly into the valley below. Jane expected a 15-minute conversation about regulatory compliance. Instead, David asked questions that made her think, really think, about the philosophical implications of her work. The problem isn't the technology, Jane found herself saying, surprised by her own passion. It's that we've created systems that optimize for efficiency without considering human dignity. We're teaching machines to see people as data points. But you're teaching them to see people as people, David replied. That's revolutionary. They talked for 3 hours. About artificial intelligence and actual intelligence. About the responsibility that comes with building the future. About the loneliness of being the smartest person in most rooms and the exhaustion of constantly having to prove your worth. You know what's funny? David said as the reception wound down. I came here looking for the next big investment opportunity. Instead, I met someone who reminded me why I got into technology in the first place. Jane felt heat rise in her cheeks, a blush she hadn't experienced since college. I should get back to my room. Early morning keynote tomorrow. Jane. Her name sounded different in his voice, not like a professional courtesy but like something worth saying. Would you consider consulting for Meridian? We're developing an AI platform for sustainable urban planning, and we need someone with your ethical framework. Someone who understands that progress without purpose is just expensive automation. The offer was intriguing. More than intriguing, it was exactly the kind of challenge that would utilize skills Richardson Tech never fully appreciated. But accepting would mean more time with David, and Jane wasn't naive about the implications. I'd need to think about it, she said. Of course. But Jane. David moved closer and she caught the scent of his cologne, something warm and complex that made her remember she was a woman, not just a COO. Don't think too long. The best opportunities require a leap of faith. That night, Jane lay in her resort bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of their conversation. For the first time in 3 years, someone had looked at her and seen not Timothy's wife or Richardson Tech's operations officer, but Jane, brilliant, valuable, desirable Jane. Her phone buzzed with a text from Timothy. How's the conference? Close any deals? She typed back, productive conversations. May have found a consulting opportunity. His response came immediately, good. Richardson Tech could use the additional revenue stream. Jane stared at his words, feeling something shift inside her chest. Timothy's first thought wasn't about her professional growth or personal fulfillment, it was about how her success could benefit their company. Their arrangement. She deleted her reply 3 times before settling on, I'll tell you about it when I get home. But even as she sent the message, Jane knew she wouldn't tell Timothy everything. Wouldn't mention the way David had listened to her ideas without interrupting. Wouldn't describe the moment she'd caught him looking at her lips while she spoke about algorithmic transparency. Wouldn't confess that for 3 hours she'd felt like the woman she used to be, the one who believed she deserved to be loved, not just strategically partnered with. The next morning, Jane delivered her keynote on building humanity into artificial intelligence, to a standing ovation. In the audience, David watched with obvious admiration, and Jane found herself speaking not to the crowd of executives and investors, but to the one person who'd reminded her that her voice mattered. After her presentation, David approached the stage. "Brilliant work as expected. Have you thought about my offer?" Jane looked out at the audience, then back at David's expectant face. She thought about Timothy, probably in his corner office right now, analyzing quarterly projections without wondering how her keynote had gone. Thought about their empty penthouse and separate bedrooms and the growing certainty that she was disappearing into someone else's life. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the decisiveness. "But I'd prefer to consult under my maiden name, Jane Carter. Professional separation, you understand." David's smile suggested he understood more than professional boundaries. "Jane Carter it is. Welcome to Meridian Ventures." As they shook hands to seal the arrangement, Jane felt something she hadn't experienced since her wedding day, the thrilling terror of stepping into the unknown. For the first time in 3 years she was choosing something for herself. Something Timothy would never see coming. Timothy first noticed the change in Jane's laugh. It happened during their monthly dinner at Gary Danko, the Michelin-starred restaurant where they'd maintained a standing reservation for 3 years. Jane sat across from him in a midnight blue dress he'd never seen, her hair loosely curled instead of pulled back in her usual efficient chignon. She was reading something on her phone, and suddenly she laughed, not the polite chuckle she reserved for client calls or board meetings, but a genuine, delighted sound that made the couple at the next table look over with obvious envy. "Good news?" Timothy asked, cutting his duck breast with surgical precision. "Just some feedback on a project I've been working on," Jane replied, tucking her phone away. But her smile lingered, and Timothy found himself studying her face, trying to decode an expression he'd never seen before. "What kind of project?" "Consulting work. AI ethics for urban planning applications." Jane took a sip of wine, a different wine than usual, something with more body that seemed to suit this version of her. "It's quite fascinating actually. Using machine learning to optimize city infrastructure while accounting for social equity factors." Timothy nodded, but something nagged at him. Jane had always been passionate about her work, but this felt different. More personal somehow. Over the following weeks, the changes multiplied. Jane started wearing perfume again. Not the neutral scent she'd adopted since their marriage, but something floral and complex that lingered in hallways long after she'd passed through them. She bought new clothes, including a collection of silk scarves that she wore with an elegance that made their employees do double takes. Most significantly, Jane began leaving the office at reasonable hours. For 3 years she'd been the last executive in the building, often working past midnight on strategic initiatives. Now she'd appear in Timothy's doorway at 6:30, briefly elegant in her coat, announcing she had evening commitments. Timothy told himself he was pleased. Jane deserved a life outside Richardson Tech. She'd sacrificed enough personal time for their professional success. But late at night in his home office, scrolling through quarterly reports he'd already memorized, Timothy found himself wondering about those evening commitments. Jane never mentioned friends or social events. Their shared calendar showed no personal appointments. Where was she going? And why did she seem more beautiful each time she returned? The answer came by accident. Timothy was looking for Jane's notes on a potential acquisition when he picked up her iPad from the conference table. The device was open to her email, and a message notification appeared at the top of the screen. From David Hendricks. Subject: Tonight was exceptional preview. Jane, your insights on predictive modeling were brilliant. You're not just solving technical problems, you're... Timothy's finger hovered over the notification. Opening Jane's personal email would be a violation of trust, the kind of boundary crossing their professional marriage had carefully avoided. But the preview text suggested something far more intimate than a business consultation. Timothy tapped the message before he could reconsider. Jane, your insights on predictive modeling were brilliant. You're not just solving technical problems, you're reimagining how humans and machines can coexist. Our team was inspired by your presentation, and frankly, so was I. Thank you for an exceptional evening. I look forward to our dinner meeting tomorrow to discuss the next phase of implementation. You bring light to every room you enter. David. Timothy read the message 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of professional admiration that felt decidedly unprofessional. The tone was warm, personal, appreciative in ways that went beyond typical client relationships. Jane was consulting for David Hendricks. David Hendricks was writing emails that sounded like love letters disguised as business correspondence. And Jane was responding to both. Timothy scrolled through their message thread, his chest tightening with each exchange. David's messages were respectful but unmistakably interested. He complimented Jane's intelligence, her vision, her remarkable ability to see solutions where others see problems. Jane's responses were more reserved but increasingly warm. Professional boundaries gradually softening into something that looked suspiciously like mutual attraction. The most recent exchange made Timothy's hands shake. David, I know this complicates our working relationship, but I have to say it, you're extraordinary, Jane. Not just as a consultant but as a person. I find myself looking forward to our meetings in ways that have nothing to do with urban planning algorithms. Jane. David, I appreciate your honesty. These past few months have reminded me of aspects of myself I'd forgotten existed. Let's discuss this properly at dinner Thursday. Thursday. Today was Tuesday. Timothy set down the iPad with careful control, his mind racing through calculations that had nothing to do with profit margins. Jane was meeting David for dinner tomorrow night. A personal dinner to discuss feelings that had nothing to do with urban planning algorithms. His wife, his brilliant, beautiful, neglected wife, was falling in love with another man. The irony was devastating. Timothy had spent 3 years taking Jane for granted, treating her like an exceptionally capable business partner while fantasizing about a life with Chelsea Morrison. Now, faced with losing Jane to someone who actually appreciated her, Timothy felt something he'd never experienced in their marriage. Desperate, consuming jealousy. The emotion was so foreign it took him a moment to identify it. Timothy was accustomed to controlled responses, strategic thinking, measured reactions. But the thought of David Hendricks touching Jane's hand across a restaurant table, seeing her smile the way she'd been smiling lately, filled Timothy with a rage that felt almost primitive. He closed the iPad and returned to his office, but concentration was impossible. Every few minutes, he checked the time, calculating how many hours remained until Jane's dinner with David. At 7 o'clock, Jane appeared in his doorway wearing a charcoal dress that hugged her curves in ways Timothy had somehow never noticed. Her hair fell in waves around her shoulders, and she wore the kind of lipstick that suggested someone might be looking at her mouth tonight. "I'm heading out," she said, the same announcement she'd been making for weeks. But now Timothy heard it differently, not a casual goodbye but a declaration of independence. Jane. Her name came out rougher than intended. "We should talk." She paused in the doorway, and for a moment Timothy saw something vulnerable flicker across her face. About what? About the fact that I've been a fool. About the fact that I married you for your mind and ignored everything else. About the fact that another man is falling in love with my wife, and it's entirely my fault. Instead, Timothy said, the Henderson acquisition. I think we should move forward. Jane's expression closed off, returning to professional neutrality. We can discuss it in tomorrow's meeting. Good night, Timothy. She left, and Timothy sat alone in his office for 3 hours, staring out at San Francisco Bay and trying to figure out when he'd lost something he'd never realized he wanted to keep. By the time he arrived home, Jane's Tesla was already in the garage. Her bedroom door was closed, light seeping underneath, and Timothy could hear her talking quietly on the phone. He stood in the hallway shamefully eavesdropping on his own wife. No, David, tonight was lovely. But I need time to think about this. About us. Pause. Because it's complicated, and I don't want to make decisions based on loneliness that I might regret later. Timothy retreated to his own bedroom, but sleep was impossible. Somewhere across their cavernous penthouse, Jane was falling asleep thinking about another man. A man who wrote emails calling her extraordinary. A man who saw light in her presence. A man who was everything Timothy had failed to be. The turning point is coming. Will Timothy fight for his wife or lose her forever? Smash that subscribe button and comment below. What would you do if you realized you'd been taking someone for granted? The wake-up call came at 2:47 a.m. on a rainy Thursday morning. Timothy had been lying awake for hours, tormented by images of Jane and David sharing intimate conversations over candlelit dinners, when his phone buzzed with an international number he recognized immediately. Chelsea Morrison. Calling from London. Timothy? I'm sorry about the time difference. I just heard about your marriage troubles through mutual friends and I wanted to. What marriage troubles? Timothy sat up, suddenly alert. Who told you about marriage troubles? Pause. Your college friend Kevin mentioned that you and Jane were having difficulties. I thought you might need someone to talk to. We always understood each other, didn't we? Timothy's chest tightened with familiar longing, but something felt different this time. Where once Chelsea's voice had filled him with romantic nostalgia, now it simply sounded like a friend. A dear friend, but nothing more. Chelsea, can I ask you something honestly? Did you ever think we would have worked out? If you'd stayed in the States after graduation? Another pause, longer this time. Timothy, you're a wonderful man, but we were kids playing at being in love. We had chemistry, but we never had partnership. You loved the idea of me more than you loved the actual me. The words hit him like a physical blow. What do you mean? I mean you were in love with the fantasy of our relationship. The spontaneity, the passion, the possibility. But when it came to real intimacy, to building something lasting, you always pulled back. Remember senior year when I wanted to move in together? You said it would complicate things. Timothy remembered. He'd been terrified of the vulnerability that real cohabitation would require, preferring the safety of romantic idealization to the messy reality of daily partnership. You're doing it again, aren't you? Chelsea continued gently. Living in fantasies instead of fighting for what's real. Timothy, Jane sounds like an incredible woman. If you love her, actually love her, then stop calling old flames and start calling her. After Chelsea hung up, Timothy sat in the darkness of his bedroom, finally understanding the pattern that had defined his entire adult life. He'd married Jane for her mind, brilliant, capable, safe Jane who challenged him intellectually but never demanded emotional vulnerability. Then he'd retreated into fantasies about Chelsea precisely because she was 3,000 miles away and safely unavailable. He could pine for the romance he'd lost without risking the intimacy he'd never been brave enough to pursue. But now David Hendricks was offering Jane everything Timothy had been too afraid to give: attention, appreciation, genuine desire. And Jane, starved for connection after 3 years of emotional neglect, was responding like a flower finally receiving sunlight. Timothy spent the rest of the night walking through their penthouse, seeing it as if for the first time. The formal living room they never used, the dining table where they ate in polite silence, the gift wall displaying every expensive present he'd bought Jane, jewelry she never wore, designer handbags she'd thanked him for but never carried, art pieces that reflected his taste rather than hers. He'd been speaking in diamond earrings and charity auction purchases, while Jane had been asking for conversation and connection. No wonder she'd found refuge in David's respectful admiration and genuine interest. The next morning, Timothy canceled 3 investor calls and drove to Cartier's Union Square location. But instead of buying Jane another piece of jewelry she'd never wear, he sat in his Porsche in the parking garage and called his executive assistant. "Catherine, I need you to clear my calendar for the next week. Everything. Reschedule the board meeting, postpone the Tokyo trip, handle whatever crises come up. I have personal matters that require my immediate attention. Mr. Richardson, the Samsung negotiation is scheduled for Friday, and the board specifically requested." Catherine. Timothy's voice was firm but not harsh. "For 3 years I've prioritized every business obligation over my personal life. That ends today. Handle whatever needs handling. I trust your judgment completely." Timothy's first stop was Jane's office. Her assistant, Maria, looked surprised to see him. The CEO rarely visited the operations wing except for scheduled meetings. "Is Mrs. Richardson available?" "She's in the sustainability planning session with the environmental compliance team. Should I interrupt?" "No, just let me know when she's free." "And Maria? Has Mrs. Richardson seemed different to you lately? Happier, perhaps?" Maria's professional expression softened slightly. "She has been more vibrant recently. She's been taking lunches outside the building, working more reasonable hours. It's nice to see her taking care of herself." Timothy nodded, filing away the information. Jane had been blooming under David's attention, becoming more herself rather than less. Whatever was developing between them was making her happy in ways Timothy never had. The realization was humbling and terrifying. When Jane finally returned to her office at 4 o'clock, Timothy was waiting in one of her client chairs, reviewing her wall of achievements, awards for ethical AI innovation, photos from congressional testimonies, her Harvard MBA diploma that he'd never properly celebrated. "Timothy? Is everything all right? Maria said you'd been waiting for an hour." Jane looked radiant despite her long day, wearing a cream silk blouse that brought out the golden flecks in her brown eyes. Her hair was styled in loose waves that suggested she'd taken extra care with her appearance. For David, Timothy realized with a stab of jealousy. "I wanted to talk to you about something important." Timothy stood, suddenly uncertain how to begin the most crucial conversation of their marriage. "About us." Jane's expression became guarded. She moved behind her desk, creating physical distance that felt symbolic. "What about us?" "I know about David Hendricks." The words hung in the air between them. Jane's face went pale, then flushed with what looked like anger rather than guilt. "You read my private emails." "I saw a notification by accident, then made the mistake of reading further." "Jane, I'm not here to accuse you of anything. I'm here to apologize." That surprised her. Jane sat down slowly, studying Timothy's face as if searching for hidden motives. "Apologize for what?" "For 3 years of marriage where I treated you like a business partner instead of a wife. For buying you gifts instead of giving you attention. For sharing a bed but never sharing my heart." Timothy moved closer to her desk, but didn't cross into her personal space. For making you so lonely that another man's appreciation feels like sunlight after a long winter. Jane's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. Timothy, why are you saying this now? Because I finally understand what I've been doing wrong. I married you for your brilliant mind, then spent 3 years ignoring the woman who possesses it. I've been emotionally faithful to a fantasy instead of being emotionally present with my wife. A fantasy? Timothy took a breath, preparing to confess something he'd never admitted aloud. Chelsea Morrison. I've been holding on to the idea of her, the romance we never really had, instead of building something real with you. Last night she called, and she made me realize I was using our past relationship as an excuse to avoid intimacy with you. Jane was quiet for a long moment, processing his confession. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but tired. Timothy, do you love me? Actually love me, not just respect me or value me as a partner. The question hung between them like a bridge he could either cross or burn. Timothy thought about Jane's laugh at dinner, the way she looked in silk pajamas during her morning Tai Chi, her passionate defense of AI ethics, the quiet loneliness he'd seen in her eyes for months. I don't know, he said honestly. I've been so afraid of vulnerability that I've never let myself find out. But I want to learn. I want to try. Jane stood and walked to the window overlooking San Francisco Bay, her reflection ghost-like in the darkening glass. David proposed to me last night. Timothy felt the words like a physical blow, but forced himself to remain calm. What did you tell him? I told him I needed time to think. That I deserved to know if the man I married 3 years ago could ever see me as more than a strategic asset. She turned back to Timothy, and he saw something fierce and determined in her expression. The same look she wore when negotiating impossible deals or defending controversial positions to the board. I'm going home early tonight. If you want to have this conversation properly, meet me there at 7. But Timothy? Jane collected her purse and coat with deliberate care. Don't come unless you're ready to be honest about what you want. I won't waste any more time on performance marriages or strategic partnerships disguised as love. She left Timothy alone in her office, surrounded by evidence of the brilliant woman he'd married and somehow managed to overlook for 3 years. At 6:55 p.m., Timothy stood outside their penthouse door, holding something that terrified him more than any boardroom negotiation or hostile takeover. The truth about his feelings for his wife. And the desperate hope that it wasn't too late to learn how to love her properly. Timothy found Jane in their living room, but it looked nothing like the formal space they'd maintained for 3 years. The expensive art pieces were gone from the walls, leaving behind lighter rectangles on the paint. The crystal vases and designer sculptures had disappeared from the mantelpiece. Even the coffee table books, carefully curated volumes on architecture and technology that no one had ever read, had vanished. In their place sat a simple arrangement: 2 wine glasses, a bottle of the Burgundy Jane preferred, and a handwritten letter folded in half. Jane herself looked different too. She'd changed from her business attire into dark jeans and a soft gray sweater that made her look younger, more approachable. Her hair fell loosely around her shoulders, and she wore no makeup except a touch of lipstick that drew attention to her mouth. I've been thinking about what you said in my office, Jane began without preamble. About learning to love me, about wanting to try. So I wrote down some things I need you to understand. She gestured to the letter on the coffee table. But first, I want you to know why I cleared away all those gifts. Timothy looked around the transformed space, noting how much more livable it felt without the expensive barriers they'd erected between themselves and genuine intimacy. Every piece of jewelry, every designer handbag, every sculpture, they were all beautiful, Timothy. But they were also substitutes. You gave me things instead of giving me yourself. Jane's voice was gentle but unwavering. For 3 years, I've been trying to translate expensive presents into emotional connection. It doesn't work that way. Timothy sat down across from her, the coffee table and its simple offering between them. What does work? Instead of answering immediately, Jane reached for the letter and handed it to him. This explains how I need to be loved if you're serious about learning. But Timothy, I need you to understand something first. David didn't seduce me away from you. You were never really present for me to be seduced away from. The observation stung because it was accurate. Timothy unfolded the letter, recognizing Jane's precise handwriting. Timothy, if you want to love me, these are the ways I need it expressed. Sit beside me without checking your phone. I've spent 3 years competing with your devices for attention and I always lost. Tell me what you admire about me beyond my professional capabilities. I know you respect my work. I need to know if you see the woman behind the achievements. Touch my hand in public like it means something. We've perfected the performance of being married, but I want authentic affection, not photo opportunities. Bring me coffee in the morning, not contracts. Small gestures matter more than grand ones. Ask about my dreams, not just my quarterly projections. I have aspirations that have nothing to do with Richardson Tech. Want me physically. Don't just keep me as a strategic asset. I'm a woman, not a portfolio investment. Most importantly, choose me every day, not just when you're afraid of losing me to someone else. These aren't demands, Timothy. They're invitations. But I won't keep extending them indefinitely. Jane. Timothy read the letter twice, each item a gentle indictment of 3 years of emotional negligence. But what struck him most was the tone, not bitter or accusatory but hopeful. Jane was still willing to teach him how to love her properly, if he was brave enough to learn. Jane, he said, looking up from the letter to find her watching him with cautious anticipation. What did you tell David about his proposal? I told him I needed to have one honest conversation with my husband before I could give him an answer. Jane poured wine into both glasses, her movements careful and deliberate. I told him that despite everything, I still believe in the man I married. That maybe we just needed to learn how to be married to each other instead of married to our work. Timothy accepted the wine glass but didn't drink. Are you in love with him? Jane considered the question seriously, as she considered all difficult questions. David sees me in ways you never have. He appreciates my mind, but he also appreciates me as a woman. He makes me laugh, he listens when I speak, and he never makes me feel like I'm competing for his attention. She paused, swirling the wine in her glass. But love? I don't think so. I think I'm in love with being seen, being valued, being desired. David offered me all of that when you didn't. And now? Now you're here, asking the right questions 3 years too late. Jane's voice held a note of sadness that made Timothy's chest ache. I want to believe you're capable of change, Timothy. But wanting something and believing it are different things. Timothy set down his wine glass and moved around the coffee table, settling on the couch beside Jane, close enough to touch her, but not presuming the right to do so. 3 days ago, I would have tried to win you back with a bigger diamond or a trip to Tuscany, he said quietly. I would have thrown money at the problem because that's the only language I knew how to speak with you. But money can't buy back 3 years of emotional absence. Jane turned to face him fully, and Timothy saw something he'd never noticed before. Tiny freckles across the bridge of her nose, a small scar on her chin from a childhood accident she'd probably told him about but he'd forgotten. The way her eyes held flecks of gold that caught the lamplight. What language do you want to learn instead? She asked. Instead of answering with words, Timothy reached for Jane's hand. Not the brief, professional contact they'd perfected for public appearances, but a real touch that lingered. Her skin was softer than he'd imagined, and he could feel her pulse fluttering under his thumb. The language of paying attention. he said. Of being present. Of seeing my wife as more than the brilliant woman who makes our company successful. Jane didn't pull her hand away, but Timothy could feel her tension, the careful guard she'd built around her heart. Timothy, what happens tomorrow when David calls? When the next crisis hits Richardson Tech? When being emotionally present becomes inconvenient? The questions were fair and they both knew it. Timothy had spent 3 years proving that work would always take priority over their personal relationship. Promises were easy to make in moments of crisis, much harder to keep when the immediate threat passed. I don't know, Timothy admitted. I can't prove I've changed with one conversation. But Jane, I can prove it with every day going forward if you'll let me. He lifted their joined hands and pressed his lips to the center of Jane's palm, not a seductive gesture, but something tender and reverent that made her breath catch. I want to learn how to love you the way you deserve to be loved, Timothy continued, his voice rough with emotion he'd suppressed for years. I want to discover who you are when you're not being the perfect COO. I want to know what makes you laugh besides David Hendricks' text messages. Jane's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for months. Timothy, I'm scared. I'm scared to hope this is real and have you disappear back into your work next week. I'm scared that 3 years of loneliness broke something in me that can't be fixed. Timothy released her hand only to frame her face with both palms, forcing her to meet his gaze. Then let's be scared together. Let's figure out how to be married to each other instead of married to our public image. For a moment, they sat frozen in possibility. Two people who'd shared a bed but never shared vulnerability, who'd known each other's professional capabilities but never each other's hearts. Then Jane leaned forward and kissed him. It was their first real kiss in 3 years of marriage, soft and tentative at first, then deeper as 3 years of suppressed longing poured out between them. Timothy tasted the wine on Jane's lips and something sweeter underneath, the flavor of hope, of new beginnings, of his wife finally letting him close enough to know her. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. Jane, Timothy whispered against her forehead. What do you need me to do about David? Nothing, she replied, surprising him. I need to handle that conversation myself. I need to be the one who chooses you, not the one who gets chosen by default because her husband finally started paying attention. Timothy understood. Jane's relationship with David, whatever it was, had reminded her of her own worth. She wouldn't end it because Timothy demanded she do so. She would end it because she decided Timothy was worth fighting for. Come to bed with me, Jane said suddenly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the invitation. Not to our separate bedrooms. To bed. Together. Like married people who actually want to be married. Timothy's pulse quickened with something more profound than desire, with the recognition that Jane was offering him another chance at intimacy he'd never properly accepted the first time. Are you sure? Instead of answering verbally, Jane stood and extended her hand to him. Timothy took it, following her down the hallway past both their separate bedrooms to the master suite they'd never shared. Jane's bedroom was exactly what Timothy would have expected. Clean lines, neutral colors, perfectly organized. But tonight, with Jane moving around the space lighting candles and turning down the covers, it felt like a sanctuary rather than a showroom. Timothy, Jane said, turning to face him in the soft candlelight. I need you to understand something. What happens between us tonight, it's not just about physical intimacy. It's about emotional intimacy. About being vulnerable with each other in ways we've never risked before. Timothy nodded, beginning to understand that making love to his wife would require more courage than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. Jane moved closer, close enough that Timothy could smell her perfume. The floral scent she'd started wearing again, the one that made him think of gardens and spring mornings and possibilities he'd been too blind to notice. Show me, she whispered, placing his hands at the hem of her sweater. Show me that you see me. Timothy lifted the sweater over Jane's head slowly, reverently, his eyes drinking in skin he'd never properly appreciated. She was beautiful, not just professionally polished, but genuinely, breathtakingly beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with designer clothes or perfect makeup. You're magnificent, he murmured, tracing the curve of her shoulder with trembling fingers. How did I never tell you that before? Because you were never looking, Jane replied simply, beginning to unbutton his shirt with steady hands. But you're looking now. They undressed each other with the careful attention of people discovering something precious they'd nearly lost. Timothy mapped every freckle, every curve, every sensitive spot that made Jane gasp with pleasure. Jane explored the body of the man she'd married but never truly known, finding scars from his college soccer days, muscles earned through solitary early morning runs, places that made him shiver under her touch. When they finally came together, it was with the intensity of 3 years' worth of suppressed connection. Timothy moved inside his wife with a reverence that bordered on worship, Jane responding with a passion she'd forgotten she possessed. But more than physical joining, it was emotional fusion. Two people finally brave enough to be completely vulnerable with each other, to risk the terrifying intimacy of being fully known. Afterward, they lay tangled in sheets that smelled like Jane's perfume and Timothy's cologne and the indefinable scent of two people who'd finally found each other after years of living as polite strangers. Jane, Timothy whispered into her hair as she traced patterns on his chest. What do we do now? She lifted her head to look at him, her face soft with satisfaction and something that might have been love. Now we practice being married to each other every day. We learn each other's love languages. We choose each other over our work, over our fears, over the comfortable distance we've maintained for 3 years. And David? I'll call him tomorrow and end our consulting arrangement properly. He deserves honesty about my choice. Jane's fingers found Timothy's wedding ring, turning it slowly around his finger. But Timothy, this isn't a trial period. If we're doing this, if we're really trying to build a marriage instead of maintaining a business partnership, then we're all in. No more separate bedrooms. No more emotional affairs with fantasies about other people. No more substituting expensive gifts for actual intimacy. Timothy captured her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing each finger individually. All in, he agreed. Starting now. As dawn broke over San Francisco Bay, Timothy and Jane Richardson lay in their shared bed for the first time as husband and wife. Not just legally but emotionally, physically, completely. Outside their window, the city awakened to another day of possibility. Inside their bedroom, two people who'd been married for 3 years finally began their honeymoon. If this story moved you, if you've ever felt unseen in your own relationship, smash that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories about love, loss, and second chances. And tell me in the comments, what's the most important love language in your relationship? 6 months later. The World Technology Summit in Las Vegas buzzed with its usual energy. 10,000 of the brightest minds in innovation gathered under one massive convention center roof. But this year, attendees noticed something different about the power couple from Richardson Tech. Timothy and Jane Richardson walked through the expo hall hand in hand, their fingers naturally interlaced in a way that suggested genuine affection rather than photo op performance. Jane wore a midnight blue dress that Timothy had chosen specifically because it brought out her eyes. Timothy wore a tie that Jane had bought him, silk with a subtle pattern that somehow made him look more approachable. More importantly, they were actually talking to each other. Not the professional coordination that had characterized their public appearances for 3 years, but real conversation punctuated by shared laughter and the kind of easy intimacy that made other couples envious. Mrs. Richardson, interrupted a tech journalist from Wired magazine, Can you comment on rumors that Richardson Tech is pivoting toward more aggressive AI development? Timothy started to answer, old habit from 3 years of speaking for both of them, but caught himself mid-sentence. Actually, Jane leads our AI ethics division. She's better positioned to address that question. Jane squeezed his hand gratefully, then addressed the journalist with the confidence of someone who knew her opinion mattered to her husband as much as to their shareholders. Richardson Tech's position remains unchanged, she said firmly. We're committed to developing artificial intelligence that enhances human capability without replacing human judgment. Our ethics framework isn't a marketing strategy, it's a moral imperative. The journalist scribbled notes, then asked a follow-up question about regulatory challenges. As Jane answered, Timothy watched her with obvious pride and admiration. The way a man looks at a woman he's genuinely in love with rather than strategically partnered with. After the journalist moved on, Jane turned to Timothy with a smile that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. Thank you for letting me handle that. Thank you for being brilliant enough to handle it better than I could, Timothy replied, lifting their joined hands to kiss her knuckles in a gesture so natural that neither of them thought about the dozen cameras capturing the moment. Across the expo hall, David Hendricks watched the interaction with a mixture of regret and admiration. He'd handled Jane's decision to end their consulting arrangement with Grace 6 months earlier, even as it became clear that her choice had less to do with professional obligations and more to do with a husband who'd finally learned how to be present for his wife. David had dated other women since then, brilliant, accomplished women who appreciated his attention and availability. But none of them had possessed Jane's particular combination of intellectual rigor and unexpected warmth, the quality that had drawn him to her in the first place. Seeing her now, radiant with the kind of happiness that comes from being truly seen and valued by someone who matters, David found he wasn't bitter about losing her. Jane had chosen the man who'd learned to love her properly over the man who'd simply been willing to love her from the beginning. Sometimes the best love stories weren't about finding the right person. They were about becoming the right person for someone who'd been there all along. That evening, Timothy and Jane skipped the industry party everyone expected them to attend. Instead, they ordered room service in their suite at the Bellagio, sharing Chinese takeout while reviewing the day's presentations and planning their company's next strategic moves. But the difference was in the details. How Timothy listened without checking his phone, how Jane felt comfortable sharing ideas that had nothing to do with quarterly projections, how they'd moved their chairs close enough that their knees touched under the table. "I have something for you," Timothy said as they finished dinner, producing a small wrapped box from his jacket pocket. Jane looked at it suspiciously. "Timothy," we agreed, "no more expensive gifts as substitutes for emotional connection." "Open it," he said, grinning in a way that made him look younger, more like the man Jane had fallen in love with during their early days working together. Inside the box was a simple silver bracelet, elegant but not ostentatious, engraved with coordinates that Jane recognized immediately. "Napa Valley," she said softly, running her finger over the numbers. "The conference where I met David. The conference where you remembered who you were when someone was paying attention," Timothy corrected. "I wanted you to have something that commemorated not the mistake I almost made, but the wake-up call that saved our marriage." Jane fastened the bracelet around her wrist, touched by the thoughtfulness of a gift that acknowledged their struggles rather than trying to erase them. "Timothy, can I tell you something I've never said before?" "Anything." "I love you." The words came out simply, without drama or qualification. Not the idea of you, not the security you represent, not the life we've built together. The man who learned how to see me, who chose to fight for us when it would have been easier to let me go. Timothy felt something shift in his chest, not the desperate possessiveness he'd experienced when threatened with losing Jane, but the quiet certainty of mutual love freely given and gratefully received. "I love you too," he replied, meaning it completely for the first time in their relationship. "I love your brilliant mind and your terrible morning hair and the way you get passionate about algorithmic bias. I love that you're strong enough to nearly leave me and generous enough to let me learn how to keep you." They made love that night with the passion of newlyweds and the tenderness of people who'd chosen each other not just once, but every day for 6 months. As they lay afterward in their Vegas hotel bed, Jane traced the wedding ring Timothy now wore with genuine pride rather than professional obligation. "What are you thinking about?" Timothy asked, stroking her hair in the darkness. "I'm thinking about the question you asked me 6 months ago," Jane replied. "Whether I was in love with David. I said I was in love with being seen, being valued, being desired. And now I know the difference. David saw me and appreciated me, and I'll always be grateful for that. But you," Jane lifted herself up to look at Timothy in the dim light filtering through their hotel curtains. "You learned to see me. You chose to value me. You decided I was worth fighting for. That's not infatuation or gratitude or loneliness. That's love." Timothy pulled his wife closer, marveling at how different this felt from the careful distance they'd maintained for 3 years. Jane fit against him perfectly, her head on his shoulder, her breathing gradually synchronizing with his as she drifted towards sleep. "Jane?" he whispered into her hair. Thank you for teaching me how to love you. Thank you for being willing to learn." Outside their hotel window, Las Vegas glittered with its promise of second chances and reinvention. Inside their room, Timothy and Jane Richardson slept peacefully in each other's arms. Two people who discovered that the best marriages aren't built on perfect compatibility, but on the willingness to keep choosing each other, even when it requires becoming better versions of yourselves. Especially then. What's your take? Can a marriage really transform this dramatically, or do people's patterns never truly change? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more stories about love, loss, and the courage to fight for what matters most.